Now it's great that you're making these insights in the beginning, because that's going to affect the entire supply chain. Whereas if you're bringing these answers a year from now, after they've built the new factory in that original country, and now you're saying, oh, actually, you can't export this, people are going to be really angry.
Before we get started with the show, here's a quick word from our sponsor, Global Training Center. As trade compliance professionals, you want to make sure that your procedures and documentation are completed as correctly as possible to avoid any delays and possible fines. We provide a range of trade compliance courses that will fit your needs. From in-person or web training to recorded on-demand courses, we can train one or even thousands on your team through your learning platform or on our portal. We can even customize a private session for your team. Go to globaltrainingcenter.com to find out more.
Hey, folks, we're on for a Simply Trade podcast, and it is a great one today. We're going to have a wonderful discussion. But before we get too far into that, I want to tell you again, you hear us say this, we're so thankful for our listenership, and you guys have been just phenomenal. Actually been sending some great comments and feedback through LinkedIn and directly some emails and whatnot. So thanks for that. But, Lalo, I am excited about today's show. This is going to be a good discussion, especially with all the trade turmoil. We're going to kind of take another little bent here where everybody's tired of the tariff talks. I think we're going to talk a little about some risk and whatnot. But how'd you find our guest here? This is you always find some cool people.
Actually, this one, I gotta give credit where credit is due. Actually, Anik actually found this next guest because obviously Anik being from Germany, and she was looking for news for the news episode, and then after talking to this group and their PR or marketing person, she thought, this actually makes better for the normal show than a news show. So she sent it over to me, and we've been working through them a while, and so now we have them on the show. So yeah, it's a show that comes us directly from the EU, from Germany. So
I love it. Well, for our listeners, this is going to be a show as you're trying to figure out how to vet maybe some new clients, new suppliers, what's going on in the world, what's the risk to your company. Do you have any risk in the company? Should you look at some things? It's there's a whole host of things that I've been heavily involved with in the past in my career, Lalo, where you start looking at sanctions, you start looking at denied parties, restricted parties, screening, things of that nature, as just an average Joe Blow company, anywhere in the world for that matter. But I mean, especially with the U.S. Situation, how do you know who you're doing business with? Do they have ties to different things? So there's ways and companies out there that seem to have specialized in, well, I'll just call it doing the vetting process, or at least looking at some things and sending out some red flags to say, this is something that needs a little more attention. So with that, I guess I would say, Lalo, why don't you bring on our guest, and we're going to get into a good discussion.
So a little bit about Erika. Her name is Erika Trujillo, and really interesting background. Really like her story. She has been on both sides of the, let's say, of the coin here, and she worked for the government, and she also now works. She worked for a Big Five. We used to call it Big Five firms, but I guess they're not that anymore. I don't know how many there are, but anyway, the back in the day, dating myself here a little bit, but she worked there, and then now she started her own company. Like I said, in Germany. So she's been around the world, and really interesting background. I mean, I know for sure, at the very least, Anik may call her back and maybe do a story or an episode with her on just the career part, not necessarily trade or anything, because Anik is all into the career part, especially with women. She's so, she's a big advocate, of course, for that. But anyway, Erika Trujillo started a company in Germany alongside one of her partners, and I hope I get this right. Okay, so please excuse me if I don't, Erika. It's Seiya?
Correct. Yes.
Awesome. Nailed it. Okay. So, we'll have obviously her information and details of her business and how to contact her on the show notes. But, Erika, welcome to the show. And thank you for coming on. I know it's late for you now and dinner time on a Friday night. So I'm sorry about that, but we'll try to get through this as quickly as possible.
Oh, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, Andy and Lalo.
Oh, thank you, Erika. So tell us a little bit about yourself, I guess, and how you got here.
Well, I mean, I think you summed it up a little bit. So I like to say that I've, had the 360-degree view of international trade. I started my career as an international trade specialist at the U.S. Department of Commerce before actually I went to law school. And then after that, I ended up coming over to Europe, and I've been focused on trade compliance in one capacity or another. So I was a lawyer in private practice at a Magic Circle firm in Brussels, looking at international trade. I then became a trade compliance officer myself in the German automotive industry. I think at the time I was responsible for about 98 locations globally. And that really informed a lot of the work that I've done since then. And let's say some of the problems that I've tried to solve. And as you mentioned, I've also been, a consultant and a lawyer in the Big Four space. So now it's, I guess, time for me to be in the innovation sphere to see a little bit something new in trade compliance. But that really sums up how I got to SEA, was seeing so many of the geopolitical changes that are going on in the world, so many of the demands that are being put on trade compliance departments, especially coming from the leadership, looking for more insight and realizing that we just didn't really have, we'll say, the technology that was necessary to rise to those challenges. So, as you mentioned, together with a partner who has a very impressive technical background in terms of process mining and computer science, we were able to say, okay, well, what do we need and how can we tackle some of these challenges together as an industry?
What would you say would be your main focus as far as the client here before we get started? Is it private sector? Is it government sector? Combination of both? I mean, what do you look at it? Is it focused on exports, imports, or just who you're doing business with?
Yeah, so we actually took a little bit of a different approach here. So we use advanced data analytics to provide what I like to call trade compliance assurance. So primarily we're working with, I would say, private industry, so multinational companies that are doing international trade. And I think in trade compliance, we're often focused on trying to know our customer, but we also forget to know ourselves. So in this way, I kind of like to think, as trade compliance officers, we're all little Captain Ahabs, right? We're really trying to find that white whale down the supply chain that's really going to be providing that, unknown risk. But in doing that, we often really overlook all of the information that we already have in our company that is already really valuable to us and often untapped. So that's a little bit about what I'm doing now, is really leveraging that internal data and solutions to say, okay, how can we get a better and more transparent understanding of ourselves and our company, whether that's transparency over the business, whether that's being able to identify those red flags and connect the dots across your own internal, we'll say, holistic information, to finally really being able to take a risk-based approach, because we have data-adjusted risk assessments that are a little bit more reflective of reality. So I hope that sums up a little bit where we fit in terms of providing this kind of new approach to trade compliance assurance for, I would say, the multinational companies. And to do this, of course, it's great that we have excellent relationships with various regulatory bodies on different sides of the pond to really understand how they're approaching also trade compliance and enforcement, so that we can really help private industry maybe get a little bit ahead of that.
So would you recommend, in looking at this, I mean, obviously you're looking at current, well, let me say, current, let's say, short-term, maybe longer-term history of transactions to say who are the parties you're doing business with. And you can probably run analysis that way. But are you looking at it from a standpoint of, in today's world, I want to look into and expanding into a new country that I haven't been in before? Should I be utilizing your services here's who I got. Here's who's going to be a distributor of my product. I'm going to export to this country, or whatever the case may be. I mean, what do you suggest somebody do that I'm like, okay, advanced technology in here, advanced analytics. This is great. What's it mean to me? How do I need to use this? How's it going to benefit me?
No, that's such a great question. And I think, there's so many different ways to use data and to use data analytics. Now, of course, if you're looking to go into that new market, you might be thinking about things like, okay, how can I do due diligence on a potential new distributor? Now, for that, I can certainly recommend that there are excellent providers out there that are doing unbelievably deep due diligence reports on these kind of companies. But usually, at least from my experience, the question comes up, which parties do I really need to be doing due diligence on? Of my existing business partners, which ones are actually concerning? Where do I need to take that additional, 3 hours to go dive off the cliff into due diligence? How do I prioritize this? So this is where, kind of to answer your questions, I would take this in two ways. First, I think you need to understand your own business, right? So if I have leadership coming to me and saying, hey, we're really thinking about moving a plant into this new jurisdiction. Is this a good idea? What insights do you have from the world of international trade to protect this investment? Now, in that case, if I have a really transparent understanding of what kind of business I'm doing, what kind of business partners I have, what kind of products I have, especially what kind of risks they bring with them, especially if they're, let's say, US origin items or subject to the EAR, in that case, I can start to give much, much better information to my leadership to help them plan how they're going to make those future investments from a trade perspective. Now, on the flip side of this, once I've started doing business, quite often, it's not the initial due diligence that's the challenge. It's the ongoing monitoring of your existing customers that becomes hard. And one of the guidances that we've heard from regulators over and over again is not just to look at ownership. We actually have to look at the behavior of the companies that we're working with. And this is really where we come into play, is not saying, oh, let's go search a bunch of external lists. But if we start to see that, you had a brand new customer that was created in your system just after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, suddenly they're ordering a lot of components, but they don't have an installed base. It's a brand new trade lane for this kind of, we'll say, product. Let's say maybe you have some other HS codes subject to Russia sanctions. Your end user on a few transactions is maybe an international border market. Maybe in isolation, all those things are a little bit weird, but they don't necessarily trigger that alarm bell. But when we start to see all of this kind of density of things happening with this particular business partner, suddenly that's telling me, hey, I need to go in and not just screen this party. I need to be looking, is this a shell company? Is there maybe some odd connections if I Google them? What is that really telling me? And so this is really where we fit into play, is finding that very actionable touch point of saying, where do we need to be focusing our extremely limited attention to deal with those kind of risks? I hope that answers your question.
Well, it does, because from a standpoint that here's where a lot of people, when they start looking at it, it's like, oh my gosh, if I have to search my whole customer database or my supplier database or whatever they're looking at, or both of them for that matter, who all it can become really overwhelming. Sounds like you would have the ability to do an initial pass of the parties you're doing business with, and especially if you're just looking, maybe not everything, but I want to look into, Europe, or I want to look into this Baltic states or South America or wherever you're going. From a standpoint, you're able to basically go through and then say, okay, here are the ones that you need to look at, and pass by that, and prioritize it from that perspective. That's probably so super simplistic. There's a lot that goes in to filtering data and analyzing that. But from your resources and all that, here's my database of who I've been doing business with. You could take that, run through that, and say, here's a few that you probably need to start looking and diving into. And that's where that deeper dive goes into, right?
Exactly. You're touching on 2 points I really like in terms of the kind of cool things we can start to do with data analytics now. And one is, of course, prioritization. We all work very hard. We're all trying to do a lot with a little bit, and liability is increasing, resources are always decreasing. So really being able to prioritize where we put our efforts and know we're doing the right things is very important. But the second part of this is this contextualization, right? Because we often get, risk assessments, or we get guidance from the government that's telling us, these are transshipment countries. So we're all looking at those places. But this is where we know we should be looking. And I think we often suffer from this, we'll say, survivorship bias in our data and what we're looking for. So sometimes it's the questions we don't even know we should be asking that we should be looking for. And I've, of course, seen some interesting examples of this. Perhaps I can give you one. We were working with a really interesting company that still is perfectly able and legal to do business with Russia. They have lots of volumes of dual use products. They do business in all the transshipment countries. And, they have a massive and incredibly diligent trade compliance team, probably one of the best I've ever seen. And, they were really heavily monitoring dual use goods. They were heavily monitoring their transshipment countries. But when, you kind of come in and do the data analytics, if they had just asked us, okay, can you look at Kazakhstan, right? Maybe certain things would have come up as out of context. But for them, it was quite interesting. Their number one driver of sanction circumvention risk was a particular material going from Brazil to Paraguay. And it was an EAR 99 item, something that nobody cares about, but it started to have all these odd kind of diversion red flags. So in this case, we weren't highlighting a particular business partner. We were highlighting, this material on this trade route is really interesting to someone. And, the client comes back and says, oh, but it's not dual use. Why does anyone care? And it turned out, once we gave a little pushback and, supported them in talking to their engineers, it was a viable substitute for a dual use item, and something that the Russians are quite interested in. So this is something we see all the time, is if you just think about pure data out of context, it doesn't really mean anything. It might be interesting, but it's not particularly informative. Whereas when we can put that data analytics really into the context of your business, then it's something that's really nice, where you can start to answer questions you didn't even know you should be asking. And that's really where I want us to get to as an industry. We have our approach, but I think overall, from a philosophical point of view, it's something that we should be thinking about is, how do we better address our blind spots? And I love this because sometimes I talk to trade compliance officers and they're like, yeah, I know exactly where my blind spots are and what's in them. and I always find that ironic.
Well, let me say this, just for, we have a lot of, folks that listen to our show that are not really in the trade. They seem to like, our show a little bit. So I want to stop and define a couple of things. One, whenever we say, folks, dual use, that means both civilian and military type applications. If, correct me if I go wrong with what you were using it as. So dual use items sometimes are, you're selling it to, domestic use in a country or whatever, that may be fine. But if it has dual use, it could also be used in military, and you've got to look to make sure, am I crossing the line here on something that, your product could be put into some type of military application of a widget or something. And next thing you know, there's a problem and it could be used incorrectly. So there's dual use. And the other is EAR 99 means that it's export administrative regulations there. And it's a low, it normally can be exported without a license. But so, folks, that's one of those things when we're talking about this and you're looking at expanding to other countries, that's one of those things to look at. So an EAR 99 could be something, and just like what Erika was just mentioning, it's some kind of material. Okay, that could have a dual use. And so you don't want your item to be used inappropriately. So there's certain restrictions and clauses and all that kind of stuff you have to look at. So as we come back to this,
But Andy, there's another factor that I would like to also add, and that although this client of Erika's, and Erika, you can also correct me if I'm wrong, but they sell it, let's say it goes to Paraguay, but if they end up selling it and it goes further out to Russia, let's say, because it could be, and so that's a re-export, correct? And you, as the original seller, you're still responsible, even though you didn't sell it to that last person. So you even have to go above and beyond just, okay, well, I sold it for what it was for, and maybe it might be a viable substitute, but that's not what we sold it for, et cetera. I mean, some companies may like try to wash their hands off of it and say, well, I mean, I did and then I guess sometimes you just, I mean, you don't know. I mean, and you honestly just didn't think that was going to be the case. But so anyway, that's what I'm just trying to say. It can go even beyond that and be re-exported, as they call it, even though it's maybe sold there domestically. But it's the where it ends up that you're still responsible for that.
Absolutely, Lalo. You make such a good point, because especially when we're dealing with anything, of course, related to US, we often have strict liability, meaning actually you don't even need to know. If it happens, and you're still liable. But still, of course, this question of what do you know or what should you know is extremely important. Now, I'm not a practicing lawyer anymore, but I like to say I'm a recovering lawyer. So I still spend many nights thinking about liability. And this is really something that I think, whether or not you're a trade compliance officer, or if you're a business person, or if you're working in a business, I think we need to take that step back and say, how do I become aware of what my company knows? Because I think this is a gap. If the CEO is like, well, I didn't know, but that human being level of knowledge is not equal to company knowledge from the point of view of the law. So this is really something that we see coming from the regulators quite often, is that you have to be proactively looking for these red flags. And where those red flags exist in your business, you are legally obligated to look into them and take steps to prevent these kinds of very serious violations from happening. So this is really, one of the, we'll say, motivators for why I was so keen to look into data from the trade perspective, is not only the immense value we can get out of doing that, as we said earlier, from, informing investment decisions, but really to get that feeling and understanding that I have some control over what's going on in my business, and I'm taking the right steps to look into the right red flags and really meet those requirements, so that if something does go wrong, I can really sit and say, I did everything necessary to follow this.
Well, let me say something here, though. We're putting out here, and there's a lot of risk and things involved, and I don't want to scare people away from international, because in my opinion, here's one of the things that's happening. Whether you like the Trump administration or not, and he's moving extremely fast. The administration is here's reciprocal tariffs. Now there's other tariffs, all these different tariff talks. Yet then there's also trade deals that are coming into play. And I mean, the first trade deal with the U.S. was with the U.K. I mean, India dropped tariffs on U.S. goods down to 0. That means India is a phenomenal market. There's a lot of countries right now that are really looking and are interested in U.S. made products, so that they can, increase that and show with the current administration that, look, we're buying U.S. goods, and they're trying to work out deals. So my point is, especially for U.S. companies, the future here for expanding markets to sell your products in other parts of the world is astronomical. There's a phenomenal business that's going to be had here. So the point being is stimulating international trade is a good thing. U.S. exports out of the U.S. has been, it was probably about down to 3.5% of GDP. And that means that if it goes to the average, which was running somewhere around 8.5 to 10% of most countries' GDP, a number of jobs being created, the opportunity is going to be phenomenal. Here's where I want to get at. You've touched on two things here that I looked at too. One is, you just mentioned it. It is, how can leadership of companies get a handle on, are there any red flags within my company and doing business? So that's one thing you need to look in your own backyard. And this is one way of utilizing services like yours, is look at and proactively do an assessment. You have internal audits. Why would you do that? To make sure that things are being adhered to from a fiscal perspective or procedure perspective. You need to do the same thing as far as, what's going on as far as who you're doing business with. Are there any risks? Are there any security risks, even with the transportation lanes that maybe going in? Is like, I saw companies that had picked a certain spot down in Mexico, and it was great. The problem is that goods loaded them on certain trucks. There was one little patch of a highway that was always getting robbed, and so it's like, okay, there's a security risk, those kinds of things. But that's your current process. Where I was going to go is the second part is, again, opening up to new opportunities. You just need to know, are there risks in those regions, and especially for your product or of your transportation lane? You picked up on it too, Erika, where you made mention, instead of a direct shot, there's going to be transit spots. And those transit spots, your point A to your end destination may be fine. The parties that you're doing with are fine. But those transit spots, your logistics folks and transportation folks need to understand there may be risk in swapping out containers onto different ships or air cargo or whatever the case may be. Is that your services would help identify those kinds of things for people, would they not?
Yes. And I think you're bringing up some really good points here. And I think this is where we can also start to shift from this purely risk-driven mindset into more of a business resilience mindset, especially for leadership. Now, I think you're absolutely right in saying that, international trade has shown very beneficial for many companies, because that diversification of markets meant that as, maybe one particular jurisdiction or market was having certain, we'll say, tariff barriers, other markets were able to compensate for that. So I think really engaging in a diversified and smart international trade practice is great for that business resilience. And secondly, as you said, I think it comes down to, do you have the agility to quickly adapt to those new trade practices? Do you have the ability to, enter new markets and really capture what's going on there quite quickly? So you're absolutely right in the sense that we spend a lot of time, of course, doing risk management, red flag identification, things like this. But, while those are maybe the sexy things, sometimes the boring things are the ones that make the most value add for a company. Just the ability to have all of your trade flows in oversight at one point on a daily basis that is continuously updating. The ability to know which of your products have suddenly become, HS codes that are subject to sanctions, or which of those trade lanes you're having not just regulatory risk exposure, but operational risk exposure. Where are you having delays in delivering to your customers? Where are you having these business inefficiencies? Because that's what costs money, time, and of course, the relationships with your customers. So I think, it's very easy, and I make this all the time. I get so focused on, circumvention. That's so cool. That's what I want to focus on. But, at the end of the day, sometimes it's the really boring things that support business resilience the most. And I think you're absolutely right in encouraging companies to really get that transparency and then have this agile approach to entering new markets.
Well, and let me give you a scenario that happened, people are familiar with, but I saw, there's no question there was a disruption in the supply chain when the Houthis started attacking cargo ships there in the Middle East. And the cargo lines, obviously you don't want to risk a, $100 million or $1 billion, vessel. So what they started doing, they changed the route and literally went around the bottom part of Africa. And so it's like, okay, increased fuel costs, it's a longer transit time, things of that nature. Where I was looking at it going, okay, if you are agile, and I love that word, it's like, lean, mean, ready to go, right? And being able to make decisions quickly is as disruptive as that was. The other side of it is, and few people looked at it initially, what's the opportunity? Well, you're coming around and you're increasing the frequency of cargo ships around the southern part of Africa. Well, now all of a sudden you got South Africa, and just north of there is Namibia. And it's like, oh, wait a minute. Are there opportunities now for companies to not only sell their products, but maybe pick up additional, resources or other products from those locations that in the past you really hadn't considered? And so having what you were talking about, it's now a strategic, okay, folks, let's look at this. And I can envision, executives having their roundtable discussions from a strategic perspective, going, okay, we've got a problem. This is what's it going to do to us? Our
how much is it going to cost?
Exactly. What's it going to cost us? But ask the questions like, all right, where are the opportunities? And most people will sit there in the room going, well, I hadn't even thought that far. It's like I'm reacting to this. But that's the other thing. So a visionary leader is going to look at, yes, there's a bad side of it. What's the upside? Where it may not offset the total bad, but it's at least it's going to minimize some of your risk. With that, with what you're talking about and how to use this data analytics you're talking about, would that not be a positive in strategic thinking and planning?
Absolutely. I mean, in terms of supporting the visionary leader needs information, right? And I think they've started to say, okay, who has answers? I need to be asking questions. Can we immediately start going to South Africa instead? Can we start immediately moving this product here? And, they're all trying to solve these kinds of problems. But to do that, they need information. They need to know, is it even legal to move these products to that country when we used to be selling them here? They need to know things like, well, which business partners or distributors do we have there? And sometimes when things change and you're now dealing with an unknown, maybe it's a new market, maybe it's a new distributor, those unknowns create kind of a gap for risk exposure, because that traditional gut feeling of like, that's not quite right, or that's not how we normally do this business, you're now dealing with all unknowns. So there's a lot of risk there. So where we come in is on the beginning side of this, helping, let's say, the trade department or whoever is maybe the C-level person responsible for this, provide the insight and answers to the strategic leaders in terms of their actual business understanding and the regulatory impacts. And then on the flip side of this, what we do is we make sure that when the visionary leaders go off into the world to make these kinds of changes, that they're doing so in a way that is also safe for the company. So as they're dealing with a brand new unknown distributor, if that starts to look a little bit weird, we want to catch that risk before it emerges fully. Or if we start to see, maybe some odd ordering practices because people are taking advantage of this kind of change and chaos in the market, then we want to make sure we're protecting the company. So I would say we support in giving the information to the visionary leaders, and then we make sure that the visionary leaders are safe and protecting the company as they go forth to make these changes.
To that point, the people that within a company that are normally you're literally engaging with. I mean, we can talk about the visionary leaders and all of that, but there's going to be somebody that is hands-on. They're the ones actually, providing the data. You're looking at it, maybe filtering out some of the questions and information. That's true. You just mentioned the trade group. It's usually going to be the import-export compliance folks, some of the transportation logistics division, whatever it is. But as they're doing that, what do you recommend that it's like, here's all this information. How should they communicate that to the upper C-suite? Because that's one of those where the C-suite's not necessarily going to be hands-on. And yet this is some of the stuff that they need to be looked at as, how do you get to the table from a trade perspective with this kind of information to participate in strategic planning? How, do you have any suggestions to break open that door for them?
No, absolutely. That's such a good question. In fact, I just told someone the other day, if I could provide, if I had a magic wand and I could wish anything for trade compliance officers, it would be almost like a training on how to communicate with leadership, right? Because I think for so long, trade compliance was that in the windowless basement, so to say, where, you have your policies and procedures and you stick them in the file cabinet until you get audited. And it wasn't until really very recently that I think more trade compliance officers were either being invited to that table or they're just banging banging the door down like, you guys, this is important. You have to listen to me. But, I think once you're in that room, it is an entirely different mindset, right? And I think you were very apt earlier in saying, it's not about risk and scaring people. I mean, on the one hand, I think, of course, it's important that the C-suite understands that they are personally criminally liable for these things. I think that's always not the worst that they are aware. But at the same time, I think you have to be going in with this forward-looking advisory. And I think this is where we went from, complying with legal minimums to really providing strategic advice, right? Because, the legal regulatory minimums are changing every other Thursday. If you're building an entire program to comply with just these frameworks, you're going to be changing that framework all the time. So I think what we need to do is really go in with this policy and business resilience mindset, come in with real data and real operational information where you can say, look, these are the products that we have that are impacted. This is how much money it's going to cost us. Or here's where our core areas of risk exposure is. This is exactly what I need to be able to manage that and bring these risks down. And then you need to be the person with the answers. When they say, can we move this production from this country to that country? You want to be the one that says, that's actually not a great idea because that particular country happens to have an export restriction on the thing you want to sell from there. So it's going to cost a lot of money if you do that. What about this other market that's reasonably comparable, but they have a lower maybe barrier for export of this kind of product? Now it's great that you're making these insights in the beginning, because that's going to affect the entire supply chain. Whereas if you're bringing these answers a year from now, after they've built the new factory in that original country, and now you're saying, oh, actually, you can't export this, people are going to be really angry. So I think the advice is try to get ahead of things as much as possible so that you're helping avoid those problems. So be a little bit more proactive in avoiding risks and issues, and then being really a strategic partner to the business with real information and real data that helps them make those decisions.
That sounds almost like a good wrap up. I mean, because we're running out of time, but I mean, it almost like you summarized it pretty good there.
I love it. I actually, you're right on the money that with that, it's again, offering some solutions, not just saying, no, I liked what you did there. This one idea may not be, the right one, but hey, here's an alternative. So, Erika, I greatly appreciate your comments and your services that you're offering. Any last things that, if somebody's interested in engaging in services like with your company, who should be doing what here?
Principally, we get conversations at all levels of the company, whether that's the trade compliance department or if that's senior leadership. So we're happy to, of course, engage at whichever level makes sense. But I think if I had one takeaway message for the listeners, it's not to be afraid of data. People often ask me, what is data anyways? And like I said, as a recovering lawyer, I want to say evidence. My technical team might say something like reality. But really where I see data is coming in is value. And whether that's, as we said, the investment insights, or if that's understanding the business, improving your operational capacities, I think people are often afraid of what they're going to find in data, but there's often quite a bit of treasure and value hidden in there. So I would really encourage anyone that's coming from the business sector, whether they're engaged in trade compliance specifically, or maybe trade compliance adjacent, to not be so afraid of their data and think about how they can really leverage that to support their organizations.
Awesome.
Folks, I got to tell you, this is excellent stuff. This is something that you should be really listening to and taking action. Hopefully that we've tapped on something that you can look at. Look internal to your current, company transactions. Who are you doing parties, who are you doing business with is what I'm trying to say. And then expanding. It's another thing. It's like, what risks are out there and what can you do? And you've got to do it. Folks, don't do it as a solo, or a silo even. You've got to make connections with your sourcing, with your transportation, with your logistics, with your C-suite, all those kinds of things, and get involved with it and have a roundtable discussion with the data. I think it's fantastic. Erika, thank you so much for some great insights today.
Thank you so much, Andy and Lalo, for having me.
Thanks, Erika. Thank you very much for joining us. Simply Trade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the show or would like to sponsor Simply Trade or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com, or you can DM us on Twitter at simplytradepod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. Simply Trade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by Simply Trade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.